House, but also non-resident fellow at both Middle East Institute and Arab Center. This is an event that's held in collaboration between the Middle East Institute and Freedom House, where we have very much focused on, through our Iran initiative, US policy on Iran, and finding ways to pressure the regime to curtail its repression while mobilizing support for the protection of human rights. I'll be moderating today's conversation, which has taken on new significance in light of the announcement of the death following a helicopter crash of Iranian President Rouhani and Prime Minister Amir Abdullahian. Rewinding a little bit, the context for our event was this new scrutiny on Iran that was brought about by the Hamas October 7 attack against Israel, and really the potential for regional escalation with the activation of Iranian allies and proxies across the region. This, at the same time, called into question the effectiveness of the US and its allies' policies and sort of countermeasures to diminish Iran's influence in the region, even though much more is at stake for Washington post-October 7th. So we decided to gather today to discuss, in the context of increased Iranian threats to US interests and allies in the Middle East, the need really for the formulation of a coherent US policy to create pressure on Iran and or to deter nefarious activities domestically, regionally, and on the nuclear front. But some of the questions that arose: how can US policymakers across the ideological spectrum really agree on broadly acceptable yet effective approach to Iran? Can the Iranian regime really be encouraged or induced to change its behavior? Can reformist factions in the regime in Tehran, as well as in Iranian society and the diaspora, can they play a role in this effort? But we evidently have new developments that we need to consider, including how the death of Raisi and Abdullahian will affect Iran's internal policy, including the battle for succession, for the supreme leader post and the presidency, but also the regime's external outlook, posture, and calculus. These are all issues that our panelists today will tackle. We will have some initial remarks and a round of questions before we open it up to audience Q&A, which is invited to submit questions via the chat as of now and throughout sort of the panel discussion. But so first, let me introduce our panelists. Alex Vatanka is the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He's also a senior fellow in Middle East Studies at the US Air Force Special Operations School and teaches as an adjunct professor at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He specializes in Middle East regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran, and he will look today at the implications of Raisi's death domestically and regionally, recalling that Raisi was presumably top candidate to succeed Khamenei as supreme leader, and how this will factor into the regime's thinking and outlook. What happens next? Is Raisi's death likely to affect foreign policy? Then we will have Brian Katulis, who is senior fellow for US foreign policy at the Middle East Institute. And he was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to US regional security. Brian will kick us off with an assessment of policy options available to the US given these developments. And finally, Goli Ameri, who is the vice chair of Freedom House's Board of Trustees and a former US Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs and Undersecretary for Humanitarian Diplomacy at the International Federation of Red Cross. Goli will focus today on how to create a US policy bipartisanship, again, in the broader context. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alex first, and then each of the other panelists in succession. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you, Patricia. Great to be with you, with Goli and with Brian. It's a pleasure, and I very much look forward to our conversation today. I'll start us off with a few sort of minutes, a handful of minutes of remarks in terms of the death of President Ebrahim Raisi yesterday, May 19th. This was in the history of the Islamic Republic since 1979, the last time a sitting Iranian president died while in office was in August of 1981, when President Rajaei died in a bombing, politically motivated bombing that happened back then, about 45 years ago. So you have had no such precedent for a very long time. Now, Ibrahim Raisi's death is not a case of political violence as such, but it has put the country on the brink. I do want to sort of get to that point later on, but let me just tackle the issue that I know a lot of people are asking. Does Raisi's death result in a power vacuum of sorts in Tehran? And to me, as somebody who's been watching Iran for, 25 years, on top of the fact that I was born there and followed the place carefully, my only conclusion is when I look at who Raisi was, where he came from politically, what he was doing politically as president, I can only conclude that he was not the most central of players in the Islamic Republic. In other words, I expect continuity in the short term. Raisi didn't set the agenda in terms of domestic policies. Take the issue of the forced hijab policy. That was something that he was asked to do by, I think, the office of the Supreme Leader, who Ali Khamenei made it clear that was his wish, one of his sort of so-called red lines. On issues pertaining to foreign affairs, regional affairs, Raisi, as president since August of 2021, did not initiate anything that was new or different in terms of what Iran was doing in the realm of its nuclear policy, regional policies, relations with China, Russia, and so forth. In other words, he essentially was implementing policies that had been designed and put in motion, in many cases, significantly before, many years before he became president. As a person, as a politician, he was beholden to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He was, in my estimation, the weakest president. He was weaker than certainly Hassan Rouhani, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, certainly weaker than Rafsanjani, and so forth. I would also go as far as saying he had the most incompetent cabinet. In the less than 3 years he was the head of this cabinet. Now, the challenges he had to deal with were severe. Again, most of them he inherited it. The sanctions that he had to deal with were issues that, frankly, he couldn't solve unless Iran makes a major U-turn on some of its foreign policy agenda. Relations with the United States, when to solve the nuclear crisis once and for all. I mean, these are not things that Raisi could have single-handedly have resolved. For that reason, they are not going to be resolved now that he's dead, but they weren't going to be resolved if he was alive either. In that sense, I believe in continuity in the short term. But let me say this, one thing that we need to watch out for, and I know there's a lot of speculation in terms of what exactly happened to that helicopter in the northwestern mountainous province of East Azerbaijan. I don't know the answer to what happened, whether this was just a simple failure, mechanical failure in the helicopter crash, but there's already speculation in terms of foul play. Again, what is interesting here is to register the fact that a lot of these people speculating about the idea of foul play are not Iranians in opposition diaspora, are Iranians inside the Iranian regime who are questioning what exactly happened. Because Raisi was leading one faction, if you will, among the hardliners, we've seen this hardliner fight sort of come out in the open more and more in recent years, most recently following the March and May Majlis elections and the fight over who gets what in the Majlis, which is ongoing. So there's a real fight going on among hardliners. Raisi was leader of one faction, the leader of a faction who wanted him to essentially succeed Ali Khamenei as supreme leader. Now Raisi's gone. What would that faction do? Do they have the power to fight back? If so, how are they going to fight back? We've seen examples of fighting back among hardliners, most notably with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who would go out and embarrass his rivals elsewhere in the hardline camp. So we might anticipate some nasty infighting among hardliners in weeks and months to come. Whether Khamenei can control it remains to be seen. And let me just wrap up here with this final point. If Khamenei cannot control it, and that's a big if, then instead of looking at sort of the issue of Iran's survival being dependent on what the regime does on its files with the United States, on issues to do with what they do in the region, the tensions with Israel, it might actually just be the case that the biggest risk to the regime's endurance and survival would be whether the regime can stay intact if this infighting that I was speaking about will get out of control and Khamenei can't stop it. So that could be one of those areas to watch out for that might emerge as a consequence of the sudden death of a man who was the president for less than 3 years, but he was really groomed in many ways to be a leader, as a supreme leader for many years to come. If you believe in some of the reports and speculations that essentially Khamenei groomed him for the last decade to make him his successor. If that is true, and I'm not saying for sure that is the case, but if that is true, then suddenly you have to ask the question, where is the Iranian succession process going to go? Because it's such a sensitive issue and could potentially get out of hand that it really could pose serious risks to the Islamic Republic's political stability. So let me stop there, Patricia, and let you lead the way.
Yeah, if I may, I wanted to ask a couple of follow-up questions before we move to a different direction. You've talked about, you've alluded to this power struggle that may ensue among hardliners. And so the question is, thinking about also the lack of legitimacy that Khamenei's son has, and this idea that there shouldn't be any succession by birthright. And the fact that there are no well-groomed alternatives right now, I don't know if you will agree with me. Some people have suggested that there are maybe two options forward. One is more reliance on the IRGC, which may hasten a more military rule, or some sort of implosion. What do you think about this?
I don't see signs of an implosion simply because of the fact that the competition, the rivalry is there for sure. But these people clearly can see if there is that kind of a big bang implosion, they'll all be losing a job and they'll all be looking for sanctuary outside Iran. I mean, if the 1979 revolution is anything to go by, is if there is that big political bang, as I said, you can't sit home comfortably if you've been a former regime member and feel that things are going to be working out for you. So they have to worry about their own literally personal security at this point. And for that reason, I think, despite what I just said, which is true, I think there's a real competition among hardliners, but they're not at the point of implosion, as you put it. So in terms of Mojtaba Khamenei, look, this is what we know about Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader since 1989. Extremely jealous about his political powers. Most famously, he has refused to have a deputy supreme leader. He has refused to have a deputy. I mean, his predecessor, Khomeini, had a deputy, right? Khamenei has refused to have a deputy. He wants to have everyone's attention, full power. He hasn't, as far as I can been able to see, hasn't sort of looked to elevate his son Mojtaba Khamenei. There are reports that he's against it. Mojtaba Khamenei, in terms of Iranian constitution, this is a regime that will find ways around, finding compromises to elevate him. I mean, that's exactly what happened to the father in 1989. Khamenei didn't have the religious qualifications in 1989 to become supreme leader. They made the necessary changes. They can do that again. This is a regime that prides itself in its ability to pursue what they call expediency. Whatever works for the regime, do it. But I'm just not convinced that Mojtaba Khamenei at this point, somebody who is basically a man behind the scenes. The Iranian public, they don't know Mojtaba Khamenei. They have known him since 2009 elections as somebody who behind the scenes have been engineering elections. It has been behind some of the most important repressive policies of the regime, has done so hand in hand with the IRGC for most of this time. And so that relationship between IRGC and Mojtaba Khamenei seems to be real, but we also have to be careful not to assume there is one IRGC, because IRGC has clearly divisions within it. But the main point I'm trying to make, Patricia, is this. Khamenei is 85. He wants an orderly succession process, yet to even suggest who he wants to take over from him. The only one person that he was more or less indicating as his preferred successor was Raisi, hasn't been his son. That could change going forward, but so far I haven't seen any evidence of that. Again, there are a number of potential candidates for supreme leadership. Khamenei can do the unthinkable. He could bring a moderate reformist clerical figure into the mix as a potential candidate to, if you will, spice things up. Again, it remains to be seen. But let me stop there.
Thanks, Alex. I'll get back. There's a lot of things that we could be talking about. I'll come back to you, but let me briefly turn it over to Brian. And Brian, how does this, or should this, change sort of the US calculus and approach in terms of policy towards Iran?
Thanks,
and
Patricia.
Anything else you want to talk about?
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Goli. And I want to thank Freedom House for partnering with us in this discussion. When we planned this, we didn't know what happened yesterday would have happened. To answer your question directly, Patricia, this is yet another wake-up call for US policy, which I see as horribly unprepared for the challenges that Iran poses today, and that the challenges Iran is likely to pose in the near-term future, not only to US national security interests, but also broader regional security. I want to just offer a few brief comments on the current state of play in US policy on Iran, and it's centered on two main propositions. Proposition number one, top US national security institutions, including the US military, the intelligence community, and most diplomats recognize that the current government in Iran is a leading strategic threat in the Middle East. So that's proposition number one. Number two, the US has no policy in any sense of the word when it comes to having a comprehensive, integrated, multifaceted approach to meet these threats and challenges. So on the first proposition, you could look at any number of assessments, both public and private, by the US government, stretching over several administrations, assessing the threats posed by Iran. I point to the most recent Global Threats Assessment by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which was released just a few months ago. And here's just one quote from it. Its assessment is that Iran will continue to threaten US interests, allies, and influence in the Middle East, and intends to entrench its emergent status as a regional power while minimizing threats to the regime and the risk of direct military conflict, which is consistent with what we just heard from my colleague, Alex. This report then outlined all that Iran does in its weapons of mass destruction programs, its conventional military capabilities, including ballistic missiles, which we saw on full display in April, and the cyber threats and malign influence operations, as well as more recent activity such as Iran's support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. And I want to highlight just this particular assessment because it's one of four countries this global assessment spotlights, China, Russia, and North Korea being the other ones, which has received the most focus. So that's to support proposition number one. There's just broad recognition that this is a challenge. Proposition number two, and you need only look at public statements by Biden administration officials, as well as just conversations you can have with people who've worked on this file. US administration officials readily admit that they don't have a policy approach to Iran that meets the challenges and threats. One open source source on this is a piece by Nahal Tusi of Politico, which I recommend to a lot of people, from April of last month. She begins the piece by writing, when I asked a US official what President Joe Biden's Iran strategy is, I was immediately met with laughter. So laughter. And this is something I hear in my own interactions. Sometimes a shoulder shrug from people saying, you know, we don't really have it right. And Tusi goes on to write that the official said, you know, a lot of people inside the administration ask that same question. Sometimes they ask it on the first day, sometimes they ask it 6 months later. So the reality is, and this is not just an indictment of the Biden administration, because I would argue this is a longstanding challenge that neither the Trump administration or the Obama administration has gotten right, is that by and large, the US approach to Iran has lacked a consistency and an integrated, comprehensive approach that deals with the full range of what Iran does to its own people, to the region, and how it challenges global security. It's, in a sense, trying to keep things on a slow burn or low boil so that they don't boil over. Case in point, if you've seen the news just from the last few days, President Biden's top Middle East advisor, Brett McGurk, and Abram Paley, who is the acting Iran envoy, were in Oman last week to hold indirect talks with representatives from Iran. Now, the goal of these talks was articulated as just trying to de-escalate the situation in the region, to avoid a return to instances that we've seen over the last couple of months, including the 350 ballistic missiles and drones. And while that might be admirable, it's incomplete. It's an approach that I think, this incomplete approach is something that both Trump administration and I think the Biden administration is not fully answered. And what I'd suggest, Patricia, is that this latest incident is yet another wake-up call about how important Iran is in terms of the threats and challenges it poses. And I'd suggest 5 areas that could be the constituent components of a new approach to Iran. I don't think we're going to get a new Iran policy between now and November of 2024 for a variety of reasons. We're going to have this reactive crisis management mode to try to keep things on low boil. But these 5 elements, very briefly, before I close, I think could be the key parts of it. Number 1 is a new approach to elevate and prioritize how the Iranian regime treats its own people. This is not just human rights, but also the question of political legitimacy that Alex was talking about. And this will become even more pressing in trying to shape the conditions of Iran's internal debate about who leads Iran. Number 2, quite obviously, is Iran's regional actions, not only its support for terror networks and groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, but it's also its direct use of asymmetric force against U.S. troop presence through various proxies. Third, obviously, and this is the one thing that Washington talked about for almost a decade, which is Iran's nuclear program, which remains a severe concern, and the risk that it poses to a cascading nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Fourth is Iran's threat to broader geopolitical stability, including its support of Russia's illegal invasion and attack on Ukraine. This is drones. This is the sending of ballistic missiles, perhaps there too. And then lastly, and we shouldn't forget this, is the interference in U.S. policy debates and U.S. national elections. Just last week, Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, warned in public testimony about not only what Russia and China are gearing up to do, but what Iran is likely to do again to try to shape debates in this country. So those would be the 5 issues, and you could come together with a broader strategic approach. But to close, I would say that we've largely had an approach that is not comprehensive, that I would articulate as passive appeasement of Iran's actions against its own people and against its neighbors, and that we need a much more activist approach that tries to shape the debate within Iran and tries to shape the trends there. And the thing I'd close, maybe as a handoff to what Goli may talk about, is that one feature of the debate here in the United States about Iran, and I think we've seen it just in the past 24 hours with this incident and the helicopter downing, is that the debate in many ways, from my sort of observation about the debate, is how predictable and in some ways trite the discussions about Iran are. That the different camps America has are divided not just in red versus blue, but different ideological camps. And even at this moment of great uncertainty, it's hard to find things that are outside of the traditional box that U.S. policy and political debates have been in. And this is why I think it's important moving forward and trying to build around these 5 pillars of a new Iran policy approach, to actually not fall into the same sectarianism or ethnic divides that we've had in our own country, the divisions between not just Republicans and Democrats, but people of different views who don't want to approach sort of the reality that of Iran today and try to face it head on. It's sort of why I think we're in a crisis management appeasement mode with Iran and have been there for quite some time. So I'll just close there and look for your follow-ups.
Thank you, Brian. I want to just, before turning it to Goli, I want to just push you on one element, because I know you've thought about it and you've talked about it before. It's this idea, I mean, you've outlined these 5 areas that could be the basis of a new Iran policy, but let me ask you, what is the viability of, let's say, a regime change policy, or let's call it democratic transition policy? And so I wonder what you think about that, and whether there is an opportunity today to force the regime to make any concessions, including, decreasing the intensity of its repression against its own people, given that, repression continues unabated, 2 years after the Women Life protests.
Yeah. So I think it's the
easy.
thing. But it's the thing that you've looked at Freedom House, and there are many people who are examining. And I think the phrase regime change actually is off-putting to a lot of people. And it's sort of a conversation killer, which I think we need to talk about new ways to discuss elevating human rights and the voice of the Iranian people in the debate. And this is the one thing where I think 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan inside the United States, whenever people try to bring the values component into it, even including in Biden's summits for democracy, where Iran was not featured as much as I think it could be. With the transition coming up, I do think we need to talk more about that. And whether we use the label regime change, to be frank, people talk when it comes to Middle East policy all of the time about regime change. When it comes to Israel today, some of the most fiercest critics and those who advocate for a quote unquote one-state solution are essentially talking about regime change. Some of the people who I think are the loudest voices who in some ways try to justify what the Iranian regime does, they're the biggest proponents of regime change in Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia. So this myth that we don't talk about regime change actually ignores the reality of most of the Middle East policy debates today. But the real serious debate is not over the label. It's what are the things that we can do, particularly as a democracy and with other democracies in Europe and even in Asia, that engage the people of Iran, that actually lift up their voice to help them prepare for a moment of transition, which may be upon us right now, but not likely, as Alex has indicated, because the supreme leader is supreme. So the sorts of tools of public diplomacy engagement that we used during the Cold War, all sorts of tools that were discarded when we unilaterally disarmed ourselves, I think we actually need to step up with that. And the core of it is, how do we engage the Iranian people? Not exile groups, not different groups that operate in the shadows, but and help them give the tools that have been used successfully in other transitions to actually mediate and navigate this debate. And again, I'm not talking about military options. I'm talking about just rearming with those diplomatic tools.
Thank you, Brian. Let me turn it now to Goli. And, Goli, I know that part of a key hurdle in this discussion is something you've written extensively about, which is the divisiveness of U.S. policy, and something which Brian alluded to. I wanted to see if you could give us your reactions and how or whether you think today, the developments today present an opportunity for increased bipartisanship within U.S. policy towards Iran. You are muted.
Thank you. I was trying to be very responsible. So thank you so much, Patricia, to you, to Freedom House, to Brian, MEI, for co-hosting this wonderful event. And in listening to Brian, I'm realizing that some of the things that we are going to say are going to be repetitive, but essentially research has shown that in order for an idea to sink in, it really has to be repeated 7 times. And it seems like with US-Iran policy, it actually needs to be repeated many, many more times than that. One of the things I wanted to start out with is that today I'm really going to do my best to consistently use the term Islamic Republic rather than Iran in this session, since the diaspora community in particular, and most likely to a large extent the Iranian people, would like for people in the outside world to see a strong differentiation between Iran itself with centuries of history and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So to set the context here, and actually repeating some of the things that Alex said, which are not Alex, but Brian said, which are really important, is there's been 2 very critical news items about the Islamic Republic in the past 2 months, which are actually of utmost importance to the US. One is the study released by Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, which Brian mentioned, and she told a US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that the Islamic Republic will pose a significant threat to upcoming US elections. She said Iran is becoming increasingly more aggressive in their efforts and will intensify their cyber and influence activities. And they seek to stroke discord and undermine confidence in our democratic institutions as we've seen them do in prior elections. And then, of course, there is the trifecta of the Russia, China, and the Islamic Republic alliance. And about a month ago, with the wars going on in Gaza and Ukraine, during a hearing at the House Armed Services Committee, the head of the US Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, sounded the alarm to lawmakers about the renewed relationship between China, Russia, and the Islamic Republic, both in the Middle East and in Africa. And he said the Islamic Republic is reliant on China, and Russia is reliant on the Islamic Republic. So in essence, the Islamic Republic is not officially part of this trifecta of, I guess, what I would call bad actors and their malign activities. China essentially buys 90% of Iran's oil, which is sanctioned by the US, and in return, China uses Islamic Republic's influence as part of an effort to replace the US as one of the dominant forces in the Middle East, according to General Kurilla. And Islamic Republic and Russia are enhancing a military relationship that US military leaders once again deem, quote unquote, a profound threat to, quote unquote, to the whole world. They've sold Islamic Republic has sold Russian missiles and drones for use in Ukraine, even helping it now build facilities that can produce these items at the scale that a modern war demands. And essentially, in a potential future showdown over Islamic Republic's nuclear program, the Republic's booming military partnership with Moscow could really give it a stronger diplomatic support and, of course, better arms with which to resist. So I'd like for us to just pause for a moment and think for a moment about the fact that the alliance between the Islamic Republic, Russia, and China is against the global power of the United States. It's not against Republican or Democrat power in Congress or the presidential office, which brings us to why partisanship on Iran policy is actually detrimental to US global interests. This partisanship, as Brian mentioned, is not really a recent phenomenon. When we review US-Iran relations since the 1979 revolution, we see that the US really has not had a consistent policy on Iran. It has either had a Republican or a Democrat policy. And US-Iran policy is not foreign policy, but it's mainly for domestic consumption. In fact, as one congressional staffer told me at some point, it's used for virtue signaling to constituents. Republicans must be uncompromising on Iran, and Democrats need to pursue negotiations at all costs. And having full knowledge of this dynamic and to attain its objectives, the Islamic Republic slow rolls one administration to the next in order to gain what it needs. That is the critical point here. And this partisanship is truly an odd stance, because when we look at Gallup polling on the Islamic Republic since 1980, consistently shows that over 95% of Americans say that the Islamic Republic's development of a nuclear weapon is a critical or important threat to the vital interest of the United States. When asked which countries in the world would you consider America's greatest enemy, the Islamic Republic is in the top 3, right after China and Russia. Consistently, over 75% of Americans feel very or somewhat concerned that the United States will not do enough to prevent the Islamic Republic from developing a nuclear weapon. So this partisan bickering might work for a domestic audience, although I'm skeptical truly, but it plays right in the hands of the clerical establishment in Iran. when they see the public bickering of members of Congress and different administrations, the message they hear is that America's House, the most powerful nation in the world, and their main adversary's house is not in order. An example is the Obama administration keeping Congress out of the JCPOA negotiations, and then subsequently 47 senators sending a letter to the Iranian parliament undermining the president of the United States. I don't understand what leverage it is that we gain by washing our dirty laundry in public. The Islamic Republic skillfully plays this partisan divide. As US policy on the Islamic Republic changes on a dime, the Republic now knows that if they don't like a policy, all they have to do is to wait and slow roll until the new administration comes in. And we all realize that in today's polarized political environment, the prospect of a unified policy is grim indeed. But Iran is not a hermit nation like North Korea that can be passed down from one administration to another administration. It's on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon. Every administration since the Obama administration has levied anywhere between 60 to 75 sanctions on the Islamic Republic, along with 5 congressional statutes, 12 executive orders, and 4 UN resolutions. Yet Iran is even further along in its nuclear capabilities. And of course, now it's also a puppet master in the Middle East and a military partner to Russia. So how do we develop and promote this bipartisan strategy? There's a happy medium between fear of, quote, escalation leading to an all-out war in the Middle East and failing to confront or even to recognize the magnitude of the threats posed by the Islamic Republic. The last time we witnessed such a consequential standstill in the US was post-World War II. In 1945, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who was the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from Michigan, and a very outspoken critic of further involvement in Europe, chose the bipartisan route. After a powerful speech on the Senate floor, he chose to cooperate with Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and Vandenberg's very famous statement that bipartisan foreign policy simply seeks national security ahead of partisan advantage, and that politics should stop at the water's edge, still resonates today. And a bipartisan long-term Iran policy can be collaboratively developed by leveraging all the tools of foreign policy, every single one of them, including smart diplomacy, sanctions, public diplomacy with the Iranian people, as Brian mentioned, negotiations with consequences, deterrence, and defensive military action if necessary. So I think I'll leave it at that and open to any questions.
Thank you, Goli. I mean, a lot to absorb from what you said. Just a quick follow-up question that will connect a little bit to what Brian said as well, which was the importance in policy as well of engaging Iranians, the Iranian people. And I wonder what your thoughts are as to whether Iranian society and the diaspora, what role they can still play in inducing regime behavior change, and how should that, or how does that, let's say, how should that impact the calculus of the US for its Iran policy?
Yeah, Patricia, that really is an excellent question. And myself, being a big fan of public diplomacy, I actually think about this a lot. And, you know, what is public diplomacy? Is engaging, informing, and influencing foreign audiences. And, you know, we certainly have 3 or 4 major media operations that are active in Iran, you know, starting from the Voice of America to, you know, Iran International, to Manatou TV. But I think we have to ask ourselves, when was the last time that an administration official or a member of Congress actually showed up on these programs? I think Jake Sullivan probably went on VOA, if I'm not mistaken, one time, but that's about it. You know, so they're not talking directly to the Iranian people. They are not there to demonstrate the goodwill of the United States toward the Iranian people. And this is important because I think the Iranian people have sent a very strong message to the world, is that they are not happy with the current status quo, and they would like to see support from the outside world, especially when it comes to the United States and the European countries.
Thanks, Goli. I'm gonna, before I open it up to the audience, I just want to ask a couple of follow-up questions to Alex. Alex, in particular, you talked quite a bit about, you know, the domestic implications of what's going on. I wanted to ask you to throw out the question of, with Raisi's death, how is that going to affect sort of Tehran's strategic policy of avoiding war with Israel and the US? And by the same token, what are the implications in your view for like the major proxies like Hezbollah? If you recall, the last time this sort of thing happened, the death of Qasem Soleimani, really Hezbollah was really empowered with the appointment of a weak successor to Soleimani. Do you think these developments are likely to further empower Hezbollah, especially that whoever comes next is not as well groomed, presumably weaker, less ready for all of this? So, and what does that mean in terms of Iran's hold on its allies and proxies in the region?
No, Patricia, thank you. Look, fundamentally, it goes to something we talked about before as well. You know, Ali Khamenei has had in recent years a number of moments where he could decide to go in a different direction. I mean, most notably, the recent tensions with Israel. This was a moment for Iran not just to double down on the proxy strategy, to actually take a step back and say, actually, is this worth it? Is this cost-benefit analysis of this policy adding up anymore? So far, he hasn't changed his mind. So far, he's sticking to his policy. I suspect he wants to sort of do this until the day he leaves this earth. But he has the option on, you know, to change course, even in terms of something you raised earlier, in terms of the presidency, which they need to have presidential elections in Iran up by, I believe, middle of July. And he could open it up. He could try and sort of look the Iranian people in the eye, the ones who live in Iran, who might still, and the numbers obviously shrinking all the time, whoever might still believe in the Islamic Republic's ability to listen to its own people. This is an opportunity to open up the election process and let some people who have given up hope in the system to perhaps maybe regain some of that hope and come back. I doubt very much Khamenei will do any of that. I think Khamenei is set on his ways. But I have to say, survival of the regime is the most important of everything he does. To your point specifically, in terms of whether, you know, proxies like Hezbollah and so on might be empowered, depending on the next president being rougher than Raisi was. As I said in my remarks, Raisi was not a main factor in terms of setting the regional policies of Iran. He can be compared to Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was much more of an architect and a power play than Raisi was. So for that reason, I think if Iran's going to change its relationship with the likes of Hezbollah, it's not going to be because, you know, there's a new president in July of this year in Tehran, but it's because it might be that Khamenei, which I suspect won't take the opportunity, could take the opportunity to shift overall course away from tensions, escalation, and ideological foreign policy to focus on the home front, the demands of the Iranian people. Because if he doesn't, the sort of scenario that Brian and Goli are describing here is exactly where Iran might be going. And that's, in many ways, that's good news for the United States if the United States wants to take the missed opportunities that Khamenei is not taking to turn the table against him and finally come up with an American policy that will actually start looking like an American policy. I think Brian is absolutely right, and so is Goli. There is no American policy on Iran. It's just kick the can down the road. It's not worth it. American politicians for years try to win votes and supporters in the United States on being hawkish on Iran. But, you know, take the issue of enforcing sanctions. You can have all these sanctions on Iran. If you don't enforce them, so what's the point? And that's the sad reality of where we are. So, you know, we can sit here and describe what's going on in Iran, but I also think it's important to describe that this is an important moment as we are at this critical juncture of the succession process, an 85-year-old Iranian supreme leader, a president that just died in a helicopter crash, an angry Iranian population. And what else do you need? This is a potentially very important moment, and it's for turning Iran away from where it's been at the last almost half a century, a threat to U.S. interest in the region. But to do that, to take advantage of that opportunity, you really do need to have something that looks like an American policy, that isn't one of kicking down the can down the road, isn't fixated on one policy today and next tomorrow, which most notably has been about the nuclear issue and the occasional hostage exchanges. So, and if you can do that with bipartisan sort of support, even better. Whether we get there or not, I mean, I leave it to Goli and Brian to talk about the possibility of an American bipartisan, Iran policy, but it would be much needed, and it would be good if it came about.
Thank you, Alex. And yes, let's get practical. And there are a number of questions from the audience that have to do with getting practical with regards to US policy. But my first question is going to be to Brian, as to Goli mentioned a number of tools, including sanctions. And we know that sanctions haven't been really effective, given the state of implementation. Now, very quickly, like, what do you think the role of visa bans, sanctions, and beneficial ownership transparency, especially given how entrenched corruption and how unaccountable governance is, in altering how these could be effective, or what role they could play in altering incentives and support for the regime internally, or in influencing the calculus of the regime? And do you find that these tools might be relevant now?
I think these tools are relevant, but we need to actually make them more present in the minds of the Iranian people. So when Goli and I'll talk about three things U.S. policy can do specifically. And one is things that we've just talked about before and related to the corruption challenge that you face, as well as, I think, inside of Iran. This issue of public diplomacy is often just added in reports at the tail end, and we don't think thoroughly about how a message can break through to the Iranian public, as well as questions related to human rights protection. And we sometimes fumble and stumble every 3 or 4 years. If you remember, in 2019, there were protests inside of Iran, and Secretary of State then Mike Pompeo wrote an op-ed, and he said a couple of things publicly about the brave Iranian people. And then we didn't really have any programs to support and connect with the people and highlight for them, especially in public diplomacy, the corrupt nature of their own regimes, and to talk with them about that, and to be more creative in terms of the tools that we use on social media. We're not really present in any meaningful way. And in some ways, this is perhaps a function of the US government, but there's also creativity in the Iranian diaspora community. There's a number of media outlets that have sprung up, but we're not organized to actually challenge and connect with the public. So sanctions, I think, can be useful tools, but if they're just one-off tactics that actually don't impose any real costs, or don't, and here's the key thing, Patricia, change the debate inside the country, then they're not going to do much, I think, in the long run, particularly in this period when a transition is coming up. Second, and related in terms of policy tools, we just briefly mentioned it, Goli and I did, but the fact that the regime in Tehran, the Islamic Republic, they very actively deploy their sharp power tools against the United States. And you can see it in some features of our even think tank debates and political debates, where they're actively engaging inside of the United States and trying to shape perceptions and narrow debates in some clear ways. And then we need to fight fire with fire, in a sense, to call that out in the way that the Director of National Intelligence did last week, but do it more regularly and in more timely fashion. We know at MEI that we've been attacked as an independent think tank in our own emails, and hackers that were linked to the regime in Tehran. It's not a secret, but we don't talk about it as much as we should. And this is, I think, a key fight. The third component of it, which I think is very precise, and it relates to my views on how the US should engage in the Middle East overall, not just with Iran, but in Lebanon and in other places, is that rather than saying the US should restrain itself and pull back from the region, and basically, essentially encourage the countries of the region to share the region with Iran, if you remember that phrase, that there'll somehow be a magical equilibrium. We should look with the reality of especially the last lessons of the last 6-7 months, that without deep US engagement in the Middle East, that is largely defensive in nature, right? If you remember what happened just a little over a month ago, with Iran shooting more than 350 ballistic missiles and drones against Israel. Those were largely knocked down by Israel, but also by the United States and by this coalition. So the third key thing that I would say is not retreat. I would actually double down on building a stronger regional coalition to address the challenge of Iran. Now, when people talk about that these days, and I'll close on this, they often assume you're talking just about military means. And no, I'm actually talking about the new picture and reality that's emerged that I've heard recently in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, that they themselves have tried to de-escalate with Iran. And they've opened up channels typified by the agreement that China famously brokered in March of 2023. So there's ways to shape the calculus of this current regime through defensive measures to try to put a stop to the things that they do to undermine regional security, but also to engage key parts of the regime. And as Alex will tell you, there are many different voices in the regime. There's hardliners, and others that are more pragmatic. But the key in that engagement by, with, and through partners in the region who've had enough of Iran's actions in the region, but are trying to find multifaceted ways of actually trying to shape their calculations to essentially get them out of the target of Iran. So it means deeper US engagement, bottom line, in the Middle East, not less engagement.
Thank you, Brian. A couple of questions to both Goli and yourself. One question had to do with how do we convince, having made the point that Iran is not necessarily a US policy priority for the administration, how do we convince the administration since the Ukraine war, especially, and after the Women Life Freedom uprising, to do otherwise? And connected to that, there was a suggestion by one member of the audience that panelists haven't really described any new policies, just challenges regarding coming from Iran. So what policies do you practically suggest, and can these get bipartisan support? I don't know, Goli, if you want to go first, and then Brian.
I think definitely Brian will probably have more details on this. I think the one thing that I want to start out with is that one of the famous sayings of the Ayatollah Khomeini early on in the revolution was that America can't do a damn thing. That's a direct translation of what he said. And in essence, I think 40-some years later, are we at that point where his words actually have come true? Because, the Islamic Republic is getting, more and more powerful. They're on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon. And, we've seen a lot of infighting between the two parties in the US, but we haven't really seen any concrete actions that is long-term. I think it was maybe even Brian that mentioned the fact that a policy becomes a policy when at least it's been in effect for a minimum of 4 to 5 years. Otherwise, it's not a policy. If every administration that comes in literally changes the view on the Islamic Republic, how do you have a long-term policy? I think that is task number one. And maybe that is also falls in the responsibility of the diaspora community, where they can have more support and more backing from the US Congress. That might be in terms, in the format of a caucus. That might be in the format of, moving towards having a select committee on Iran. Those are some of the things that I think the diaspora community needs to think about, so that their voice becomes more important on this topic. I think that's been one of the problems. Like, for example, with other countries like Cuba, for example, we see the power of the Cuban American community. And that's one of the things that, at least up to the Women's Life Freedom movement, we had not seen from the Iranian American diaspora community. So I'll leave it at that and let Brian take it over.
Sure. Well, I highlighted in my previous remarks 3 clear policies I think the US should engage in: direct public diplomacy with the Iranian people, but with people, as you've just mentioned, in the diaspora and civil society here, and creating greater linkages. Second, engaging more directly to confront the malign influence and the political warfare that Iran's regime engages in our own debates. And then thirdly, a much more robust, unified defense, again, not going to conduct military regime change in Tehran, but to actually respond to all of the threats that they continue to pose. I would add to that, Patricia, and I'll answer the question of how you prioritize this, is that I actually think there's more that the United States, with its partners in the region, can shape the state system of the Middle East. And you know this from Lebanon, we've talked about this quite a lot, is how do you garner the resources to compete with those political forces that are terrorist groups that operate as militias in several states, including Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Syria. Syria is a tougher sled, but I think showing up in those places and actually working with partners in the region to compete in those spaces to help make life better for the people of those places. Anytime there's chaos, and we see chaos in the Gaza war, I just spent this last week talking about what is the post-war situation in Gaza, what might that look like? And the simple fact of the matter is that Iran has built partnerships, as Alex can attest to, with different Palestinian factions, including the Islamic Jihad and Hamas, that has exploited the Israeli occupation, the lack of the resolution of that conflict. When this conflict comes to an end, a key way to contest Iran and its axis of resistance in the region is actually for the United States to show up in coalition with its partners to make life better for Palestinians that are living in Gaza once this war is over. And I would submit you that the current Islamic Republic of Iran is not likely to be part of that coalition to make life better, to make there be better rule of law and non-corrupt governance in a place like Palestine. And I know that sounds fantastical, but it does require the United States to engage more deeply in the Middle East, which I'll close with this. In the crowded landscape, and I think Holly Dagres raised this in the question and answer, it's a very important question. How, at a time of the Ukraine war, China on the agenda, and Goli sort of answered this, is that you can create the argument for more resources to address things head on. And again, by more resources, I'm not talking about another war. I'm talking about a plussed up diplomatic effort that actually enhances security with a coalition in the region that faces down the threats from Iran. You can make this through various tools. And from what I can see in reaction to April 13th, 14th, in reaction to Mahsa Amini, there are voices on the left and the right that are deeply concerned about the role that Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, plays in undermining security for the region and for its own people. So I don't think this is going to happen, to be clear. I said this before, in 2024. I think this is going to be a longer game of the sort that we saw emerge on a challenge like China, that we've had a select committee on China that brought Republicans and Democrats together to talk about multifaceted solutions, not just a military presence, but also what are the economic tools that we're going to use to compete with China. We need that same sort of formula to be put into play here. And some of the 4 or 5 ideas, maybe 6, 7 that we've offered here could be the constituent components of what that pathway forward could look like.
Thank you, Brian. We have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask 2 questions to the 3 of you, and that will be a good way to conclude, because those are 2 interesting questions. The first one is that, Brian mentioned this notion that the connection that the US should create must be within Iranians, inside of Iran, and not dissident groups. So what is meant by dissident group, and why should the US not make that connection and use encouragement of their efforts to affect people of Iran inside? So what should that take in terms of shape or form? And connected to that, what can be the role of the diaspora, the Iranian diaspora, in sort of inducing a policy change on Iran? And I throw it all to you, each, and then we can use these as concluding thoughts to this very interesting panel. I don't know, Alex, if you want to go first.
Sure. I'll be very brief. I know time is almost up, so I'll be very brief. Look, I do think, both, answering the question in one go. Obviously, Iranian public opinion in Iran is the most important. Those are the people who live in Iran, experience repression on a daily basis, are going through these horrendous, policies that clearly majority of Iranians are against. that doesn't mean the diaspora that have left the country, even the ones who left many years ago, don't have an emotional attachment to that old country where they come from, or don't have anything to contribute with. I think actually the opposite is true. They can contribute greatly. But what you need to have in place is that linkage between the Iranians in Iran and the diaspora. Give you one concrete example. There is no freedom of press in Iran. The diaspora press has been able to be a voice for so many Iranians for so long now, exposing some of the many wrong things that are going on, from corruption to treatment of political prisoners, so forth. This constant pressure that's been on the regime couldn't be possible without an active role by the diaspora. So diaspora has a role to play, shouldn't be ignored, shouldn't be dismissed as irrelevant. I think that's absolutely wrong. But at the same time, the people inside Iran shouldn't be forgotten. And I have to say this, we shouldn't also forget that a good part, I assume a good part of the Iranian regime support base are also coming around to the conclusion that this regime is simply too detached from its own people at this point. How do you bring about defections? How do you get more people who are today getting their paychecks from the regime to actually come to the conclusion that it's best for them to jump off this ship? Because that's the moment where the regime can reverse and undo it. So again, for all that to happen, we can go in many different directions. There's so many factors, from Khamenei to the succession issue to Russia, China to United States. But for the sake of argument or this discussion we're having today, let me just say this. I think Goli mentioned it earlier. Khomeini said it, America can't do a damn thing. That's also been the slogan of Ali Khamenei for the longest that I can remember. United States can't do a damn thing. He will say that because he more or less believes it. He believes that he can prevail over these sanctions. It will cost him some billions here and there, but he can overcome the sanctions. So how do you get Khamenei's attention? So you want to get the attention of Khamenei and his regime to maybe shift their behavior, but you also at the same time want to make sure that the Iranian people and the opposition take you seriously. Now, I know what I just said can sound contradictory, but that doesn't have to be. That means you have policies that will serve U.S. interests, depending on the circumstances and depending on the actions that the regime in Tehran takes.
30-second last words by Goli and Brian, or else MEI will never invite me to moderate the discussion again.
Actually, I think everything Alex said was spot on, so I'm going to defer to Brian.
Yeah, and I'll just close by saying that one key thing we need to do is avoid resurfacing the debates of the past. So oftentimes when people talk about the need for change inside of Iran and its leadership, the retort is, oh, you want to go to war like we did in Iraq in 2003? And the answer is no. What we're talking about here is a more organic engagement. And to your question of the diaspora, what I've learned about Iranian Americans, Iranians living overseas, is there's so many talented professionals in so many fields, not just in business, but in the arts and in other places. And there's a vibrancy that exists there and a desire to connect back to the homeland. And some of this is, when I say organic, it's not something that US policy can really guide itself. There's a power in what civil society in exiled countries can actually do if they work together. And there's a challenge, I think, in getting different Iranian American and other groups to work together. But I think connecting back to the people at this time when there will be a transition, when Ali Khamenei is quite likely not going to be on the scene in the next 5 or 10 years, and preparing for that moment in a way that actually helps people lift up their voice for what they really want. We've seen it episodically, Mahsa Amini and in other protests, but preparing for that moment is not really solely, or it's not even a government project. It requires organization within the communities that are concerned about this great country called Iran that is currently ruled by the Islamic Republic regime. So I'll close there.
There's never enough time to talk about Iran, but we need to end here. Thank you all for an incredibly informative and substantive and insightful conversation. And thank you, MEI, for allowing us to collaborate and host this discussion. Thank you and goodbye.